So next we have two planners. You both are planners by trade, right? I should probably.
Architects.
Architects, okay. Oops, apologies. From Org Permanente Modernity in New York City. So both Garine and Kobi here were planners embedded with Malawi's National Planning Commission, helping them co-draft Malawi's Secondary Cities Plan. And so they're going to talk about that process. They're going to talk about Malawi's Secondary Cities Plan. So I'll hand it over to them. Here you go, Kobi.
Thank you. Hi. So thanks so much for the invitation and for allowing us to be part of this event. It's extremely interesting for us. It's a field that we're engaged in for quite a while. Try to put it full screen. So we, Garine and I, we work in Organization for Permanent Modernity. We're an architecture planning firm based in New York and Brussels. And we'll present a project, a case from Malawi we've been working on for the past 4 years now. For some reason it cuts the slide so you don't see logos on the bottom, but here it is.
Hope you don't have to do that every slide.
Okay, maybe we can resolve it. But the point here is to say that this work was developed by our firm ORG together with the Malawi National Planning Commission, which was just established at the time we were assigned this mission to support the government with essentially creating urbanization plan for the countryside. For context, we'll start with, do you think it will work if I go to full screen now?
No. Bottom there's a full screen icon in the lower right hand corner. There's a.
I see it.
No, it should be that one right
This
there.
one here.
Yeah, but that's not mine.
I don't think there's a way to do full screen.
Okay, we'll just work with it as it is. Okay.
He did tell you PowerPoint, right? This is. I'm joking.
No, I know. I made it complicated by using a PDF. Just for context, in case you're not so familiar with the region and with Malawi specifically, what we see here is Malawi kind of in it with its neighbors. The gradient here shows population density per square kilometer, and you see that Malawi is definitely the kind of denser country in the region. A few numbers to highlight: Malawi has today around 20 million in population, whereas the urbanization rate in Malawi, I don't know if you're able to see it, it's close to 17. It's one of the least urbanized countries in the world, and this figure mostly points to the fact that over 80% of the population are in fact living in the countryside. Most of them are subsistence farmers, and the main challenge here, or the main question here, is kind of what does this mean when you look at long-term policy planning and spatial planning for the country in terms of kind of the equilibrium between cities and the countryside. If you look at the urbanization rate today is under 1% per year. So here we're seeing a projection of population growth, or the urbanization growth rate, assuming 1% urbanization growth rate, a 2% and a 3%, which is very significant in terms of the capacity and the ability of cities to absorb urban population. And of course, the next question is, how does that impact the massive pressure on land in the countryside? Today, it's not a pressure that's necessarily evident on the ground. You don't see people really kind of short in land, But if you look at the numbers in terms of population growth and land, arable land, that's available for rural populations, you see that in the next generation, in about 30 years, most parts of the countries, especially the parts of the country that are better connected and more attractive for new cities to attract residents, they will be not viable from a smallholder land use perspective. The average will be less than half a hectare per family quite fast, which is very risky from a national planning perspective. We used quite a bit the research coming from the Merit Institute in projecting the numbers for the next generation and even further. As many African countries today are doing, they're kind of looking at 2063 as a benchmark year to kind of plan towards their future, about 100 years from their independence. What we used as kind of a rule of thumb is that as population doubles, land requirements triple. That's kind of taken from very impressive research that we used from the Merit Institute. We projected that on the status quo of Malawi today, where most urban settlements will need to expand at least 3 times in the next 2 generations. So with the Malawi government, we essentially started developing spatial integration plans supporting their national economic agenda for urbanization, industrialization, and agriculture development, and basically supporting the government from a technical assistance perspective in preparing a spatial guide for urbanization. And the main hypothesis here is really around development of secondary cities. We do not see them as new cities. They are expansions of existing cities. Today, they might be, in fact, quite small. They might be under 10,000 in population, but the projections, and because of their location, they are expected to grow very fast in the near future. And one element of this diagram that's worth emphasizing is not just the secondary city that's kind of marked in the white circle. It's the relationship between the secondary city and its neighboring villages, which will remain agricultural and will need increased support and connectivity with urban services, with infrastructure for water, for transportation, and for land resource management. So when we say secondary cities, we in fact mean kind of a larger radius around a specific center that represents an urban center, but in fact encompasses also the rural area or the settlements around the city itself. We developed a method of planning that goes from national scale to project scale, and the emphasis here is really on the kind of the relationship that occurs on both ends of the diagram. It's not just about kind of going from large scale and identifying the location for a project. It's also more opportunistically looking at projects that are already in the works or planned or seem to be viable and accommodating them with larger urbanization plans as clusters of investors, of investments coming from both private sector and from public sector, including the DFIs and the World Bank, etc. As a stakeholder framework, we developed this as kind of a mission diagram, which really shows kind of how our peers, our partners, the National Planning Commission, embedded in government, together with their technical teams and the Ministry of Statistics and etc., kind of managing the program, ourselves as the key technical advisors, together with other areas of expertise, local government and the relationship this program has with them, as well as the variety of stakeholder groups, including the private sector, community-based organizations, NGOs, etc. What you see here on the top left is more about kind of cross-ministerial coordination and external to the very program itself. So what we were aspiring for was really a broad-based kind of engagement with a large variety of stakeholders around working groups that look at different scales of planning and investment. I can talk to the reality of it later. In fact, we managed maybe to engage not the full spectrum of stakeholders that we wanted. We also worked during COVID, which was another kind of challenge. But generally, this is still, till today, the framework in which the program is operating. Okay, now a bit to the kind of technical aspect of our work. We started from a very rigorous analysis of the three pillars of the plan: urbanization, industrialization, and agriculture, and looked at the various layers of environment, of economic activity, of infrastructure, whether it's there today on the ground or planned to be invested in the near future. And we mapped a whole range of issues that relate to urbanization process and agricultural development opportunities. And we overlaid them or intersected them against a set of settlements that are existing today, quite diverse, 41 settlements across the country. And we kind of looked for areas that feature both density from a population perspective and concentration of multiple uses. So not necessarily kind of two residential communities or kind of monofunctional, but really kind of villages or settlements that present both diversity of uses and substantial density. And we had a way to kind of rank them. We use this group as to identify those locations where we think there will be greater benefit in investments in urban development and expansion, as well as large infrastructural projects. We developed a profile for each of those settlements that included an analysis of their agricultural land suitability, their potential for urban expansion, as well as their existing and expected or potential for infrastructural connectivity from a transportation logistics perspective, together with a number of other economic indicators and programmatic indicators. I'm sorry, this is like impossible to read. If you're interested in this, this is all available online, both from our website and from the government's website. There's a whole book that explains it in detail, and you can read all of this. The end result of this process was really kind of evaluating and comparing those settlements against one another from a perspective of development opportunity. It went through a rigorous debate process with the various ministries and stakeholders. And the end result was, in fact, selecting 8 settlements that seem to have the most opportunity for development from a variety of reasons. Those 8, the decision around those 8 cities, it's kind of, it was a bit of a mix, let's say, of scientific, academic analysis, and of course political opportunity, and as our colleague said, kind of the network of who knows who and the friendships, etc. The result is that we have now 8 locations in Malawi that are designated for rapid development and investment from the government, and of course it's now used, or hopefully will be used in the near future, for the multilaterals, for the investors to look towards and look to invest in them from an economic development perspective. Each city has its own economic activity identified as kind of a core from a first mover perspective, what will be kind of the safest bet from an economic sector perspective development. But of course, all of them are meant to be designed or developed as diverse from economic perspective in terms of industrial activity, from service economy, from tourism, etc. And Garine will talk a bit about one of the 8, the city here, number 4, in the district of Salima, and specifically the city in Chipoka.
Can you hear me? Before I get into Chipoka and Salima, I just want to talk about our approach in project clustering, and as Patrick mentioned in his presentation, in areas where informal settlements are ubiquitous and land enforcement policies are challenging, infrastructure really becomes a tool to land use management. And so in this context, we propose a robust multi-purpose design agenda to be implemented in a specific set of locations where clusters of projects can aggregate and catalyze a process of urbanization and economic development. So these projects not only serve as facilitators for the realization of the 3 pillars of the mission, but also act as leverage for subsequent investments to come. The locations we identified where these investment clusterings could happen represent all opportunities where development can happen across sectors, and this is where multi-purpose infrastructure projects are important, and basically we rely on a lot. This means that we think of a water system that not only services the agriculture industry, but also the urban and rural communities that are around that area, or a port facility that caters for a passenger ferry, but also a fisheries community in that location. And so to be able to promote this coordinated and comprehensive master plan development that relies on the clustering of projects, we developed a spatial planning process that cuts through different scales of planning to ultimately reach to a list of projects that go from urban development to different types of infrastructure projects, as well as nature restoration and aquaculture development project. And so on top are the 8 different prospective cities and our list of potential projects that could be clustered in these specific locations. So now looking at Salima and Chipoka, and just perhaps before we talk about this particular plan, the first scale of analysis that we use, which is not this one that comes before this, is the larger watershed boundary and district jurisdictional boundary kind of overlay to make sure that we're addressing matters of environmental social government analysis and environmental impact statement, all of which will be necessary when these projects head towards implementation. And once that larger area was defined, then we zoom in and try to have a closer and deeper understanding of the area we're looking at, with particular focus on where the settlements are, what are the population growth trends, the major land uses, as well as the relationship between all of these things together. So in this case here, we're looking at Chipoka city, which is one of our secondary city proposals, which is the closest water front city to the capital of the country. It is also the only point in the country that port infrastructure and rail meet. So Chipoka urban is close to Salima, which you can see on the top left side, which is this area's urban and kind of political center, if you will. And finally, Nkhata Bay, which is more of a touristic and leisure area. So in our proposal, we see Chipoka Port being rehabilitated and turned into a major industrial and logistics port for the whole country, as well as basically, like, there's a whole set of projects that I'll get into, but basically Chipoka turning into a large city with its port. We do the same for Salima and Nkhata Bay, and think about the natural resources that are all around these urban centers, and kind of think of a way to also structure them or assign them a certain use. So the low-lying areas that you see in the kind of dotted green would be ideal for wastewater treatment facilities and or certain types of agricultural development, like rice fields, whereas the higher lying lands, which are in orange, would be suitable for different types of agricultural development. Finally, the highest points, which are where the WT circles are, would be suitable for water reservoirs to serve both the agricultural fields as well as the urban areas and the rural communities that are in this area, basically. And so in terms of numbers, if today Chipoka, or this area at large, has around 300,000 inhabitants, basically in one generation, in 2014, that number would be a million and a half. What we're looking at here is, again, the same area in an aerial view, but now starting to spatialize the different projects that either the government has already planned for, has some funding for, and the projects that we're proposing as part of our planning exercise, with a particular focus on Chipoka, to go back to this idea of project clustering. And so the list of projects, again, range from urban development, like a port district development, or a lakefront tourism boardwalk development, to infrastructure projects and natural resource management. As we develop this list of projects for each area, we are also obviously thinking about implementation. And for us, the master plan and in general the plan is not just a tool to conceptualize the vision that we have for the city, but also a kind of a pragmatic way to test, and assign sites and footprints for each of these projects. And before doing that, we need a sense of like the numbers that we're catering for. So what we did, again, for a number of locations, is a population growth scenario analysis. This analysis was done both on the national scale, which is what Kobi mentioned in his part, but also taking a closer look at specific areas, such as this one, which is the Chipoka urban area, and running the same types of scenarios, from a status quo scenario to a controlled growth scenario and the maximized density scenario, to see what types of settlements we're trying to design, what numbers, and ultimately also, which is something very important in our case, basically the the amount of land that would be available or we should aim for each family. And so you can see in the scenario 1, the status quo, if there is no intervention done and kind of the same pattern repeats, in 2 generations, each family would only have access to around 0.3 hectares of agricultural land, which is not sustainable, whereas with the other 2 scenarios, that number would go up to reach 1.1 hectares. And so, like I said, we then translate these projects into master plans, and start thinking about a spatial relationship between, a port district area and commercial boardwalk or a fisheries facility in relation to a passenger ferry terminal. And start to thinking about them not just as a spatial relation, but also as a sequential relation. And so, thinking about which projects should be our low-hanging fruit and would be best to be implemented now versus in 1 generation from here, so in 20 years, let's say, and then in 2063, which was kind of a benchmark year for us. And so, for example, if we look at the map on the top, we're highlighting kind of a few settlements within the industrial port district that could be rehabilitated and kind of activated. In 20 years, we can start seeing this small area expand and different economic kind of activities happen throughout this area with a certain infrastructural connection starting to shape up between them, and also some land formalization happening to finally reach to this 3rd stage where there's already a certain relationship between residential, industrial, economic, and all of these uses together. This is the Chipoka urban area we're looking at, but looking at it from its agricultural periphery. We are highlighting here a number of basically projects that we highlight, starting from, I don't know if you can see, but number 1, which are kind of more structured and formalized smallholder farming communities. Number 2 is a more kind of a linear growth that naturally happens, but kind of thinking about a certain growth boundary and structure for them. 3 is existing villages, rural farming communities, some form of shared social amenity here. As well as agriculture, commercial agriculture, farming, aquaculture, and infrastructural connection between this agricultural community and area to the Chipoka urban center, which is in the far back. Looking at this area from now the lakeside and kind of taking a closer look at the port area and the city center, what is important for us here to highlight is, again, something I mentioned, which has to do with proximity and kind of an interchange between the different types of projects and sectors, because we're dealing with spaces where land is high, where demand on land is very high. And so we're not just imagining these secondary cities in kind of tabula rasa context, but always building on an existing form of urbanity. So in this case, there is an actual port, there is some form of town center, and so all of these elements are kind of building on that and expanding on that. So just to quickly highlight, we have the industrial and logistics ports on the right side next to the fisheries port, and then the commercial and tourism boardwalk area. We're highlighting the existing kind of settlement with number 6, and then an expansion for residential neighborhood on the left side, and then the kind of a more mixed-use commercial area in the central spine. Throughout the different cities that we were looking at, we're primarily interested in 4 types of spaces and projects that we think hold greater potential for integrative urban development. And these are the industrial areas, the small farm communities, the urban centers, and the recreational areas. And with all of these spaces, again, none of it would be actually possible without an integrated investment in infrastructure projects that would make all of this actually possible. So here we're looking at Chipoka port and industrial hub area. In the back, we see the logistics and industrial area connected to the rail, and then in the foreground, the kind of fisheries docking area. Next is the Chipoka Boardwalk and kind of the more recreational area, which is adjacent to the port space that I just showed. Here again, we would have a ferry terminal that could be shared both by local or international tourists, as well as just the residents of the area, as well as recreational spaces also designed for both populations. The third one is the Chipoka Urban, the kind of the heart of the city, where it's essentially developed around a multimodal hub, station, market, and civic and cultural spaces. Finally, because we're dealing with pressure on agricultural land and the viability of smallholder farmer, we are really interested in thinking about the small farm communities' spatial requirements and what that means in terms of thinking about the future of smallholder farmer and its relationship to urban centers.
Thanks. We're almost done with the presentation. I'll just wrap up and say that every one of the 8 cities is now in a pretty similar stage where we're kind of zoning together with the government for locations for the main economic activities in terms of their needs of land and infrastructure investments. This is again the example from Chipoka, where we have a short list of 7 main projects that are meant to be planned in tandem. It's a cluster of investments. The first one that we're kind of looking at as the first investment to land is going to be the Fisheries and Aquaculture Hub next to the port. It's project number 1. Currently led by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, where the Department of Fisheries sits. And they are now in the process of basically figuring out where land is available for this investment, organizing the local communities towards that investment, and making sure that this investment also happens in a way that relates to the future links to other investments to come: industrial, transportation infrastructure, water infrastructure. To end, I'll just kind of end with a question that kind of points, I think, to some of our conversations that we've been having with the Charter Cities Institute, which is really kind of about how to make sure that policy and legal frameworks are working for the benefit of cluster planning, for planning of projects in tandem, to make sure that planning and design and investment processes are most efficient, and support the governments and communities for long-term implementation strategies. That's it. I'll end here. Thank you very much.